Hello everyone, it's Lindsay, and today's video, rather than doing a project using this month's kit, I thought I would do kind of a how-to video. I know many of you are not only new to Bible journaling, but new to just crafting and using crafting supplies in general. Some not so much, but things may have changed. So today we're going to be talking about stamping and what all you need to use, or you need to be able to use these stamps, some tips and tricks for inking up your stamps and things like that. So I'm hoping that this video will help, no matter where you fall in the, realm of new to veteran crafter, stamper. And that way, this video will be here in case you see somebody in one of the groups that's struggling with stamping, and then you can refer them back to this video as kind of a how-to. So what I have here are a couple stamp sets. I have the one from the June Faith Art box. That kit is sold out, but there are still a variety of stamp sets available over at Creative Retreat, and this applies to any of those stamp sets that you use. And then I also have the Victory Alpha from Creative Retreat as well, and I wanted to show you some tips for stamping with alphas. In addition to your stamps, you're going to need some acrylic blocks. So if you were a stamper years and years ago, you might be familiar with stamps being on wood blocks. That was kind of the common way to do stamps, was the red rubber mounted on wood blocks. But this is just easier. It saves more space. I don't know, I just much prefer stamps in this form. And so to stamp with clear stamps like this, you are gonna need an acrylic block to mount them on. I have a couple different sizes here. You are gonna wanna have a variety of sizes because it's better to work with a block that's as closely sized to the stamp that you're using as possible. And I'll kind of show you why that is. I also have a couple of inks here. These are both from Creative Retreat. They both say chalk, but they're not both chalk. One is misprinted. One is a pigment ink and one is a chalk ink. I'm not gonna go into details about different kinds of inks. I do have a video on my own channel talking about that. I'll link that down below in case you were curious about different types of inks. The only reason I picked these two is because the pad itself is made out of different materials, and so I wanted to show you what you needed to be, aware of when you're stamping with different materials. One is soft and squishy in the pigment ink, and the chalk ink is a much more firm felt pad, so I wanted to show you the difference between that. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna start with your stamp set here, and you're just gonna remove the plastic backer. Do not throw this away. This is what protects your stamps, keeps them clean, keeps them from just falling off and getting lost while you're storing them. And so you do want to hold on to this and just set it aside, and you can put it back on there once you're done stamping. So these are a cling stamps, so they are kind of sticky. We're gonna start with this little butterfly, so you're just gonna gently pull this off of the plastic backer. These are a lot more durable than you would think, and so the chances of tearing it are pretty minimal, but I am just always careful when I pull it off of the backer sheet. So the flat side of the stamp is what is going to stick to your block, and so you're going to stick this flat side down onto your block. I am using the smaller one over the bigger one, and I'll show you in a minute here why I do that. So then you're just going to press that onto your block, and now your stamp is ready to use. When I'm starting out with a new stamp set, this stamp you'll see is a little bit colored, and that's because I've already used it. But these other ones here are clear. So when I have a new stamp, I like to rub it on the back of my hand. And what that does is it just adds a little bit of the oil from your hand to the stamp. There's usually like a residue that's on the stamps, and that's from how they're manufactured. And so if you're having an issue with not getting a nice, clean, solid stamp, it might be because there's a little bit of residue on your stamp. So I either rub it on the back of my hand or take a pencil eraser and lightly rub a pencil eraser across the stamp. This is especially helpful on really solid stamps. So if you're stamping, there's a little bit of solid area on here, but if you have a very, very solid filled in stamp, doing this will really help with the impression that you get. So now that that's all ready to go, we can ink up our stamp. And this is kind of where I think it's important to know how to ink up your stamp. So let's start with the firmer ink pad. So I have done a lot of in-person Bible journaling classes, and one of the common things I see are people just like mushing the stamp in there, trying to get as much ink onto the stamp as you can. That is not the best way to go about it. It's better to just lightly tap the stamp and evenly coat it with ink, and you're gonna get a better impression. So with a smaller stamp, you can take it stamp to the ink pad, or you can go ink pad to the stamp. It just kind of depends on what you're comfortable with. With larger stamps like this frame, I've found it better to go this way, so tapping the ink pad onto the stamp. But a smaller stamp, you can go this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm just very lightly barely touching this ink pad. I'm not squishing it way down. So I'm gonna do one lightly tapping, and then I'll do one squish down so that you can see the difference. So I'm just kind of looking at the stamp to make sure I have an even coating of ink, and I am just barely kissing the stamp pad with the stamp. And then you're gonna go above your paper or your page or whatever you're stamping on, and just go directly down with firm, even pressure, and then you're gonna pick straight up. You don't want to wiggle or move or pull it or go in at an angle. You want to go straight down, firm pressure, pull up, and that's going to give you the best impression. If I go in here and really push down into this ink, it's going to load up this stamp with tons of ink. It's going to get into all the areas, and I'm also going to get ink in places I don't want ink. So then when I stamp this, you'll see, yes, it is darker, but those lines have kind of like a halo around them. Sometimes you'll get like too much ink on there and it'll be a big squishy mess. I'm gonna cover that because I don't want my ink pad to dry out. To clean my stamp in between, I like to use baby wipes. There are also stamp chamois. I'll link some down below that you just use water with them, but baby wipes are just my kind of go-to. I'm going to clean off my ink that I have on the block, and then I'm just going to lightly rub the ink off. Again, you could use a stamp chamois. I'll link one of those down below. You just add water to it, and then you just rub the stamp on it, and that cleans it. Most inks, if they're colored ink, will have a tendency to stain your stamp. So this is not dirty, this is clean, it's just stained. It does not affect how the stamp works at all. Okay, so then I can just pull this back off. Don't throw this away because it's reusable. You can use this over and over and over and over again. I'm gonna stamp this on this bigger block so you can see what happens when you use a block that's too big. So I've gone ahead and stuck that down on that big block, and we'll go back in with this ink here. So as I'm inking this up, because I have so much more block than stamp, you'll see it is much more likely that I'm gonna get ink in places that I don't want it to on the block. And then what happens is when I go to stamp in my Bible, I may have it touch and smudge and get ink in places that I don't want. So when you are, picking what block to use, it's best to have a variety of blocks and you use one that is close in size to the stamp that you're using. I prefer these ones that have grids on them. As you can see with both of these have a grid on them. They do have some that don't have grids. The grids come in handy especially when you're stamping sentiments or alpha, stamps. That way you can make sure everything is lined up and straight. Okay, and so then this can go right back on to your backer sheet. If you find that your stamps aren't sticking, whether they're not sticking to your block or they're not sticking to your plastic, it could be that the flat side of the stamp has gotten dirty. All you need to do is wash it with clean water, like warm water, and soap, like Dawn's dish soaps, just something kind of gentle. Wash it, let it air dry, and it will be sticky again and nice and clean. Same thing if you're having an issue with, any kind of ink staining, or it's gotten down into the nooks and cranny of your stamp and you're having a hard time cleaning it and your baby wipe isn't just cutting it. You can just put it into, I usually get like a bowl because you don't want to drop them down your sink. Put them in a bowl of warm water with some soap, wash them really good, rinse them real good, and then just let them air dry. Okay, let me show you this other ink. So that first blue ink I used was a chalk ink, which means that the pad itself is a firm felt pad. There isn't a lot of squish to it. This here is a pigment ink pad, and so there is some squish to it. I don't really want to stick my finger in there, but this is a hard, firm, and this is squishy. So this one, while pigment ink typically does not bleed through your Bible pages and is kind of the preferred ink to use, because it is a squishier pad, you just have to be more careful when you're inking it up. So because this is a bigger stamp, I am going to take and go this way here, and again, I'm just very lightly tapping. It's better to go in and have to tap it several times rather than just going and like squishing tons of ink. And I'll do it both ways so you can see the difference. So I'm just very lightly just kissing that ink to the stamp. The stamp is so pretty, especially with this teal color. This is Bonsai Green from Creative Retreat. Okay, so I went straight down, and now because this is a larger stamp, I'm just very carefully kind of pushing my fingers around to make sure that I get nice even pressure. I'm not wiggling anything, and then I'm gonna pick straight up, and that's gonna give me nice crisp lines. Let me show you the difference if you go in here mushing it. So if I squish this down and really ink up and push down, like people kind of have a tendency to do when they've never stamped before, because you think, okay, I want, you know, maximum coverage with ink, so I'm squishing, squishing, squishing. You can see the ink has gone into all of these little nooks and crannies. So now when I stamp this, this stamp actually is a really nice quality stamp. It's great with the details. So I didn't have a super messy stamp. It is darker, but now I've got all of this ink that's down in there, and so that's wasted ink. That all has to now get cleaned off. It's harder to clean and it's wasted. It's not going onto my paper, it's going onto my baby wipe. And so you're gonna have to, you know, re-ink or buy new ink pads sooner if you're inking them up like that. So now I've got this ginormous mess that has to be cleaned on this stamp. Okay, so we'll just kind of get it the best that we can there. Okay, let me give you some tips for alpha stamps, because this was not something that I had thought of until I did it in one of my videos and somebody was like, oh, I'd never thought of that before. So with alpha stamps, typically they are individual stamps, so each letter is on its own. Here I'm gonna cover this one, saving my backer sheet. Okay, so when I'm spelling out a word, I like to stamp as many of the letters as I can at a time, and that's just my preference. You can stamp each individual letter if you want, but it's a little bit harder to get everything lined up and keep it straight and all that goodness. So if I'm gonna stamp, let's say we're gonna stamp the word hello. So I'm gonna pull off my H, and this is where the grid comes in nice. And remember that you want to go, you're gonna spell your word backwards, because when I flip this over, then it will be right side up. So I'm using this grid line. I'm squishing my letters as closely together as they can, but you don't want them to overlap. If they overlap, wherever the higher places are gonna pick up the ink more, and you're not gonna get a good even impression when you stamp it down on your paper. Okay, for hello has 2 L's. So I'm gonna go H-E-L. And then I like to try to find a letter that's close in size to that L, since I need a double letter. So the U is pretty close. So I'm gonna stick down that just as a placeholder for my other L. And then I'm gonna put my O. So I have H-E-L-U-O, but I'm gonna pull this U off because I don't wanna stamp that U because I'm stamping hello, but it's just gonna leave me a blank spot. That way I can come in and stamp another L. And this just saves me some time, and it just makes things a little bit easier. Okay, again, because I have, you know, bigger than just a small butterfly, I'm gonna take my ink to my stamp, and you can see I'm just tapping until I can see that I have even coverage of ink on my stamp. So tap, tap, tap. And you do want to work, you know, fairly quickly because the ink does dry. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and again straight down, give nice firm pressure. The stamps from Creative Retreat are really nice qualities. Some cheaper stamps are squishy, and so you don't get as good of a impression as you do with a more firm stamp. Okay, so I'm gonna clean those, and now I can go back in with just the L and fill in that second L, and that's how I get my spacing. That's how I save time from, you know, stamping individual letters. Now, because I'm just stamping one letter, I'm gonna go to a smaller block so I don't make a mess. I'm gonna take this to the ink pad since it's a small stamp. Again, lightly just tap, tap, tap to ink it up. And then I can go in and stick that L. Ideally, I'd want my head right over the top of it, but I didn't want my head in the camera frame for you guys. So there is that. If you stamp them individual, you can definitely do that. It's just harder to get things lined up and evenly spaced, and so I find it easier to just load up as many letters as I can at a time. And so again, I can just take this, stick it back on here, stick my backer sheet, and it's ready to go. I like to store my stamps in these stamp pockets. They're definitely not necessary. I'll link the ones that I use down below, and I just put a piece of cardstock in there with the type of stamp that I'm using, slide it in there, and then these all get stood up in a basket. That's the easiest way for me to store them. You do just wanna make sure that you're storing your stamps not in direct sunlight. This clear, some are made out of acrylic, some are made out of Oh, another material. They're just made out of a couple different materials, and they will yellow and become brittle if they're left in direct sunlight. So you just want to make sure that you're storing them, you know, in a nice cool spot. And I think that should be it for tips for stamping. If you have any questions, be sure to leave those down below for me. I'm happy to answer those questions, but this should kind of help get you guys started. If you are new to stamping and never stamped before, you can see this one here is super filthy. I don't like to put my stamps away like that. I'm gonna need to take this one and clean it in my sink, because you can see there's ink all in the little crevices, and that's why you don't want to go mushing into your ink. But hopefully that is helpful. If you have any questions, leave those down below. Check out the description box down below for links to everything that I mentioned, everything that I used. Give this video a thumbs up if it's helpful. Be sure to share it if you see somebody that's struggling with some stamping. This might give them some helpful tips. And subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed. And until next time, thank you so much. Bye-bye.